Hi, my name's Mike Freitas, and I'm presenting the case study on Ciba's acquisition of Allied Colloids. So to begin with, what caused Allied Colloids to become a takeover target? So why did Hercules consider Allied Colloids a good target? Well, first, thanks to the nature of the industry. Each specialty chemical has its own niche, which allows Hercules to diversify within their own industry and gain access to a wider customer base, while taking advantage of greater diversification. Secondly, they consider the current management of Allied Colloids to be vastly underperforming the market. Their margins weren't as high as they could be. For example, while Allied Colloids had a gross margin of 16%, Hercules had their own of 21%. So they believed that they could bring in their management, their style, and run things better. Finally, the high margin products they sold allowed them to make quite a bit of money on their profits, and Hercules saw a large growth potential for the future. Now, after all the negotiation was done, how did Ciba value the gains from their merger with Allied Colloids? So Ciba wound up paying 3.615 billion Swiss francs for Allied Colloids. Now, of that amount, 2.2 billion went to goodwill. So clearly the value they were getting didn't come from the physical goods they were purchasing. Instead, it came from the intangibles. For example, the technical expertise of the workers. This expertise and experience allowed them to expand into a market that they weren't as involved in previously. This technical expertise would form the basis of their water treatment division that they would establish. In addition, since they came in as a white knight as opposed to being a hostile invader, they kept the management structure intact. This is an aspect that Hercules would have been unlikely to take advantage of, since they would have experienced a greater turnover and loss among the employees of Allied Colloids, in addition to however many employees they would wind up cutting in order to cut costs. Now, since they weren't getting rid of people and they were keeping the management intact, this meant that the growth and cost cutting would have to come from elsewhere. Well, mainly it came from targeted overhead and more efficient operations. Their low corporate finance costs and their more efficient supply chain were going to be incorporated into Allied Colloids operations, and that would allow Ciba to increase margins as well as expand Allied Colloids marketing opportunities. They would be able to sell those products through Ciba's pre-existing marketing channels, and that would allow them to grow continually and make more of a profit. So what effect did the acquisition have on Ciba's balance sheet and their performance? So the immediate impacts came in the form of 3.26 billion francs that Ciba spent to acquire Allied Colloids. 2.2 billion of that was recorded as goodwill, which went into the assets, and there was approximately 400 million in property, plant, and equipment, and then finally the remainder of the changes showed up in their retained earnings because they were expensed. On the liability side, it showed up since the acquisition was financed entirely by debt. That entire 3.26 billion showed up as long-term debt, which was a massive increase from their 200 million that already existed. Now, as far as their income statement goes, the performance is kind of masked because not all the changes could be explained by the merger. There were economic troubles, including an economic crisis in Asia, as well as issues in Eastern Europe and South America. On top of that, their stated income was affected by a strengthening Swiss franc, which was steadily growing stronger compared to foreign currencies, and had a negative impact since a large portion of their products were exports. Now, during 1998, most of Ciba's product lines showed some shrinkage in their net sales, and that trend followed into 1999. However, the water treatment division was actually growing in sales and provided the entirety of their growth during 1998 and 1999. However, this was offset by the restructuring costs that they had to incur. So while the water treatment division may have made them 700 million francs, the restructuring ran them 1.1 billion. So Ciba wound up showing a net loss for that year, and their earnings continued to be dragged down into 1999. So without taking advantage of an extra decade plus worth of history, looking at the deal, who won and who lost? Well, just based on the basic narrative of the hostile Hercules versus the white knight Ciba, Ciba won, because they came in and they got their new thing. But beyond that, it's not quite as clear, since if Ciba's assumptions are correct, then yes, they stand to a net economic gain from their acquisition. However, if their assumptions are off somewhat, or if things change, then they could wind up losing money, but they didn't know that yet. Now, just as a guess, you can kind of assume that Ciba overpaid a fair bit, given that Alloyd claimed that a fair valuation of their company would value their stock at about 175 pence a share. Ciba, on the other hand, wound up paying 205 pence. So they clearly paid more than Alloyd thought they were worth. But if Alloyd thinks that it's a good investment and they're right, then they still win. On the other hand, Hercules definitely looks like a loser. This was their third failed acquisition in 2 years. And on top of that, they were still facing the threat of a credit downgrade from Standard & Poor's. That was even if the deal fell through. So that could cast a shadow over any future debt-funded acquisitions. Now, as an aside, they get a consolation prize. Namely, they owned 500,000 shares of Alloyd Colloids going in. And those shares started at about 125 pence. By the end, they were worth 205. So that's about a 60% jump in value over this entire experience. So while they may not have gotten Alloyd Colloids, they did make good 25 million francs, in addition to any shares that they purchased over the course of the exchange. Now, the shareholders of Alloyd completely win in this one. If they'd been holding them and, say, purchased them at a low beforehand, then they could have got in at 101 pence and left at 205. So doubling your money in under a year sounds like a win to me. Now, within Alloyd, they're generally winners. The employees on the production line, well, they weren't looking at Hercules coming in and slashing jobs. So they've got to be feeling better. The management, well, their heads were definitely on the chopping block had Hercules won. So they're probably feeling pretty good about themselves. And as for the chief executive, David Farrar, he was definitely going to go if Hercules wound up buying the company. So instead of being out of a job, he maintained a position of authority within the new company and made a fair amount of money in the process. Now, instead of relying on predictions, we can actually look back in history and figure out maybe who really won in this deal and who lost. Now, within a year, David Farrar resigned, so he's gone. And that pretty much safely qualifies him as a loser in this deal. Now, as for Ciba, they experienced some trouble in the immediate aftermath, since they were having to face a hostile economic climate, and it took more time and money than they liked to incorporate Alloyd with their existing operations. However, they managed to do all right through the early 2000s. However, in the long run, rising energy and material costs struck them down. And finally, in the start of 2008, they had a net loss for the year, which was highlighted by a 595 million franc impairment of goodwill, which of course tied to the acquisition. So in the end, that's kind of what drove a stake through them. They were finally purchased by BASF, a German chemicals firm. Now, they purchased Ciba for 3.4 billion francs, which was actually less than Ciba spent on their acquisition a decade earlier. And just as another comparison, when Alloyd was purchased, Ciba paid 205 francs per share. When Ciba was purchased, they paid 50 a share. So they're not looking so good in retrospect. Now, Hercules probably wouldn't have done any better job at managing the economic climate than Ciba did, since they had additional obstacles to overcome, and there were industry-wide issues. And finally, Hercules actually met a very similar fate in that in the same year, Hercules was purchased by Ashland Incorporated, another large chemical firm which was expanding into the specialty market for $3.3 billion. So given the overall trends of the industry, they were kind of headed in the same direction.